The geographical location of Troy was of enormous strategic and economic importance, forming a crucial key to understanding its historical role, both in myth and in real history. Troy was located in the far northwest of Asia Minor in modern-day Turkey, near the city of Çanakkale, directly on one of the narrowest and most important sea passages in the world, the Dardanelles Strait, known in antiquity as the Hellespont. This strait connects the Aegean Sea with the Sea of Marmara and thus forms part of the natural waterway between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. A city located at this point, therefore, controlled shipping traffic between two important world regions, Europe and Asia, as well as the exchange of goods, people, and ideas between East and West. Ancient Troy was thus far more than just a cultural or military center. It was an economic bottleneck. Traders, diplomats, and warriors had to pass this way, and whoever controlled Troy could levy customs duties, forge alliances, or block trade routes. This location gave it a central role for centuries in the interplay between the empires of the Aegean region, the Hittites in Anatolia, and the early cities of Mesopotamia. The exact location of ancient Troy was debated for centuries, and it was the greatest archaeological sensation of the 19th century when Heinrich Schliemann identified the remains of the city on the hill of Hissarlik. Archaeological investigations later confirmed that this site was located on a hill that offered access to both fertile hinterland and the sea coast, ideal conditions for a prosperous settlement with influence in many directions. Interestingly, Troy was closer to the sea then than it is today. Due to sedimentary deposits from rivers, especially the Scamander, the coastline has shifted significantly over millennia. Nevertheless, its proximity to the coast allowed both merchant ships and war fleets to dock, another indication of the city's maritime strength. Troy's location is also a crucial element in the mythological narrative of the Trojan War. It explains why the Greeks embarked on such a long and elaborate siege in the first place. It was not just about honor and the recovery of Helen, but also about controlling an economically and geopolitically significant point in the then world order. Today, Troy's former location is not only an archaeological site, but also a symbolic one. The name Troy represents the intersection between myth and reality, between East and West, between legend and history. Early period. The early period of Troy represents a significant chapter in the development of Bronze Age cultures in Asia Minor. The first archaeological traces of settlement date back to about 3000 BC. This oldest phase of the city is designated by archaeologists as Troy I. Even at this time, it was not a simple village, but a fortified settlement with thick walls, containing round and later also rectangular residential buildings. The strategically favorable location at the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait made the site an important point for trade and traffic between the Aegean and Black Sea regions from an early date. In the course of its history, Troy was repeatedly destroyed and subsequently rebuilt. This is evidenced by the various archaeological layers, classified as Troy I to Troy Roman IX. Each of these main phases comprises several sub-periods and bears witness to a long, almost uninterrupted settlement over more than 3 millennia. The destructions were caused by natural disasters such as earthquakes, by fires, or by military conflicts, but each time the city was rebuilt, indicating its enduring importance and resilience. In the early phases, the city was probably ruled by a local elite, which is evident, among other things, in the so-called Megaran houses. These large rectangular buildings with courtyards suggest social differences and an organized societal structure. Even in its early period, Troy was not only a settlement, but also a political and economic center of supraregional importance. Troy also played a role culturally and religiously from early on. Finds of clay figurines, small altars, and offerings suggest that religious rituals and cults had a firm place in the everyday life of the inhabitants. This early form of religious life sheds interesting light on later mythical traditions, in which Troy is closely linked with the gods of the Greek pantheon. The early period of Troy thus shows that the site was a significant cultural, economic, and political center long before the legendary Trojan War. The fact that Troy was rebuilt again and again over centuries, despite repeated destructions, speaks for its central position in the region. The traces of these early settlements form the foundation for the myth that made Troy world famous in later times. Troy 6 and 7a. The archaeological phases 6 and 7a, dated from 1700 to 1200 BC, are considered by historians and archaeologists to be the most likely candidates for the historical core of the famous saga of the Trojan War. These two layers show both cultural and architectural features that can be well reconciled with the events described in the Iliad, even if Homer's epic is a poetic work and not a factual report. Troy 6, the earlier of these two phases, represents the pinnacle of the city's development. During this time, Troy was a powerful and wealthy city with impressive fortifications. The massive walls made of large limestone blocks with towers, gates, and courtyards bear witness to a high degree of organization and defensiveness. The settlement itself was extensive and accessed by a clearly structured street system. The houses were partly two-story, built of mud bricks on stone foundations, and bear witness to a certain prosperity. Finds of imported pottery, jewelry, and weapons also attest to Troy's active trade relations in both the Aegean and Anatolian regions. Towards the end of Troy 6, there was a catastrophic destruction layer, the causes of which were long disputed. Recent research suggests that a strong earthquake damaged the city, which possibly also led to internal unrest or external attacks. This was directly followed by Phase Troy 7a, which lasted about 50 to 70 years. This epoch is archaeologically less rich but is characterized by military aspects. The houses were built closer together, indicating a higher population density, possibly a sign of a siege situation or the reception of refugees from the surrounding area. Storage vessels buried in the ground also point to precautionary measures against a possible enemy. The destruction of Troy 7a around 1200 BC is particularly striking. There are indications of a violent end with layers of burning, weapons, and human remains. These archaeological traces fit well with the scenario of an attack or a prolonged siege, as also described in the Iliad. While Homer speaks of a 10-year war, the remains of Troy 7a do not provide a concrete time frame. However, the dramatic downfall of this phase could well have been the echo of a real conflict, which was later incorporated into the myth. Although there are no written sources from Troy itself, many indications suggest that a significant warlike event occurred during this time. Thus, the phases Troy 6 and 7a not only offer a fascinating archaeological insight into the Bronze Age world, but possibly also the real background for one of antiquity's most famous stories. Golden Age. Troy 6 marks the pinnacle of urban development on the hill of Hisarlik, the site generally identified with ancient Troy today. This phase, dated to approximately 1700 to 1250 BC, represents the city's heyday and is described in archaeological research as particularly impressive, both in terms of its construction and its political and economic significance in the Bronze Age. The city possessed massive fortification walls made of large limestone ashlar blocks, up to 8 meters high and several meters thick. Towers, bastions, and monumental gates structured this fortification system and demonstrate that Troy was not only a wealthy but also a militarily well-secured city. Such defensive structures point to an urban upper class that had to secure its power, possibly against hostile neighbors or in conflicts with competing trade centers. Within the walls, the city was carefully planned. Wide streets, paved paths, and multi-story residential buildings indicate a high degree of organization and technical knowledge. Some buildings were even equipped with courtyards, storage rooms, and workshops, suggesting a lively urban life and a differentiated social structure. The architecture is strongly influenced by the Anatolian style, but also shows influences from the Aegean world, particularly from Minoan and Mycenaean cultures, indicating intensive cultural and economic contacts. Trade relations were crucial for Troy 6. Numerous finds, including finely crafted pottery, jewelry, metal objects, and imported goods, prove that the city was part of a far-reaching network. Particularly striking is the discovery of so-called Mycenaean pottery, which originates from the Greek mainland. Troy was not isolated, but actively participated in the exchange between the Balkans, the Aegean, and the Anatolian hinterland. Its location at the entrance to the Dardanelles also made Troy a strategically important place, both for trade and for controlling the strait between Europe and Asia. Politically, Troy 6 was probably an important regional center. Whether the city was its own kingdom or acted as a vassal state within larger power blocks such as the Hittite Empire is still not definitively resolved. Hittite sources, however, mention a place called Wilusa, which many researchers equate with Troy. In these texts, Wilusa is described as an important, sometimes rebellious partner, which would underscore Troy's role as a self-confident, independent power. Overall, it can be said that Troy 6 was far more than a myth. It was a flourishing, fortified, and culturally highly developed city that played a central role in the late Bronze Age world due to its location, architecture, and supraregional relations. This golden age formed the historical setting that centuries later became the backdrop for an epic war in the Iliad and other epics. Mythical king. King Priam is a central figure in the Trojan saga and is considered in Greek mythology to be the last great ruler of Troy during the legendary Trojan War. Although his existence cannot be unequivocally historically proven, Priam has enormous symbolic significance and shapes the image of the city of Troy as a proud and noble residence that stood in conflict with the Greeks. Priam is portrayed in Homer's Iliad as a wise, just, and at the same time deeply human king. He ruled at a time when Troy was under great pressure from the advancing Greek forces. Despite the danger and the approaching downfall, Priam repeatedly shows his ability to be level-headed and his striving for peace. His role goes beyond that of a mere ruler. He is the moral center of the city and symbolizes the tragic loss of power, homeland, and family. As the oldest king of Troy, Priam is often described as a loving father who has numerous sons and daughters. Particularly well known are his sons Hector, the famous hero and defender of Troy, and Paris, whose abduction of Helen is considered the trigger of the Trojan War. Priam's relationship with his children reflects the internal conflicts of Troy. Hector stands for conscientiousness and defense of the homeland, Paris for passion and the trigger of the war that ultimately leads to the fall of the city. The figure of Priam also stands for the tragic dimension of war. In one of the most moving moments of the Iliad, Priam, despite his age and royal dignity, dares to go to the enemy camp to reclaim the body of his slain son Hector from Achilles. This encounter shows his human greatness and the deep family ties that are not lost even in war. Priam appeals to the humanity of his opponent and reminds him that even enemies should be aware of their mortality and humanity. Priam is also portrayed in the sagas as a descendant of a royal line that ruled Troy for generations. His fate is closely linked to the downfall of the city, which is depicted in many narratives as an inevitable event guided by the gods. His reign therefore symbolizes the end of an era, the last glory of Troy before its demise. Overall, King Priam in mythology embodies the ideals of wisdom, care, and human dignity, but also the tragedy of a ruler who loses his kingdom and family in the midst of a destructive war. His role and character traits give the Trojan saga deep and emotional power and make him one of the most memorable figures in ancient mythology. Judgment of Paris. The Judgment of Paris is a central mythological moment considered to be the catalyst for the Trojan War and is deeply rooted in Greek mythology. It is a story in which the world of the gods directly intervenes in the fate of humans, showing how personal decisions and divine interventions are inextricably linked. Paris, a Trojan prince and son of King Priam, is at the center of this dramatic event. The narrative begins with a feast on Mount Olympus, the seat of the Greek gods, where Eris, the goddess of discord, was not invited. In revenge, she throws a golden apple inscribed for the fairest among the guests. Three goddesses claim the apple for themselves: Hera, the goddess of marriage and queen of the gods; Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. To settle the dispute, Paris is chosen as an impartial judge to decide which of the goddesses should receive the apple. Each goddess tries to bribe Paris with various promises. Hera offers him power and kingship over all of Asia. Athena promises him wisdom and victorious warfare, but Paris finally chooses Aphrodite. The goddess of love promises him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, the wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. Enticed by this promise, Paris awards the golden apple to Aphrodite, triggering a chain of events that culminates in the legendary siege of Troy. The Judgment of Paris is not just a story about beauty and desire, but also symbolizes the fateful consequences of decisions and the power of the gods to steer human destiny. Paris' choice shows how personal weaknesses, in this case his infatuation and vanity, can have profound effects on the fate of entire peoples. His decision is at the heart of Troy's tragedy because it not only ignites a war but also illustrates the relationships between humans and gods. In the subsequent narrative, Paris' decision leads to his abduction of Helen or her voluntary flight with him, depending on the version of the saga, which arouses the wrath of the Greeks and leads to the 10-year Trojan War. The Judgment of Paris thus represents the origin of one of the greatest narratives of ancient literature, which unites human passion, divine influence, and political conflicts in an epic story. This saga continues to have a great influence on literature, art, and culture today, as it deals with archetypal themes such as beauty, power, betrayal, and destiny. The Judgment of Paris illustrates the close connections between the actions of individuals and the course of history, and how mythological motifs are used to tell and explain complex human experiences. Abduction of Helen. The abduction of Helen is considered the central trigger for the Trojan War and is one of the most famous stories in ancient mythology. Helen, often described as the most beautiful woman in the world, was the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, a powerful and respected ruler in Greece. Her life was characterized by splendor and grace, and she was considered a symbol of beauty and seductive power. The Trojan prince Paris, rewarded with Helen's love by the goddess Aphrodite through the Judgment of Paris, travels to Sparta to bring her back to Troy. The circumstances of the abduction vary depending on the tradition. In some versions, Helen flees voluntarily with Paris, seduced by his charming manner and the promise of a new life. In others, she is carried off against her will. Regardless of the portrayal, this act is considered a severe breach of hospitality and marital fidelity, which shook the Greek world. Menelaus sees the abduction not only as a personal betrayal but also as a political provocation. Since Helen is not only his wife but also an important part of his domain, the loss becomes an attack on his honor and power. In the society of that time, the concept of honor and prestige was of central importance, and the demand for Helen's return becomes the impetus for a large-scale military action. The abduction of Helen symbolizes more than just a love conflict. It also stands for the deep political and social tensions of the time, in which personal relationships were often inextricably linked with power and war. The story shows how private decisions and interpersonal conflicts can plunge entire societies and empires into war. In mythology, Helen is often portrayed ambivalently, on the one hand as a seductive woman whose beauty brings destruction, on the other hand as a victim of divine will and human power struggles. This ambivalence makes her a fascinating figure whose fate continues to inspire artists, writers, and historians to this day. The abduction of Helen remains a strong symbol of passion, betrayal, and the tragic consequences of power conflicts in the ancient world. Greek invasion. The Greek invasion of Troy marks the beginning of one of the most famous and dramatic episodes in ancient history, the Trojan War. After the abduction of Helen, wife of the Spartan king Menelaus, the Greeks mobilized their forces under the leadership of Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae and Menelaus' brother. Agamemnon was an experienced and determined ruler whose influence and power enabled him to unite many Greek princes and heroes for a common military action. The siege of Troy began with a large naval expedition, in which numerous Greek city-states gathered their ships and troops. The siege itself lasted for a period of 10 years, which underscores the extraordinary tenacity and scale of the conflict. Troy was a strongly fortified city, whose mighty walls and strategic location at the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait posed great difficulties for the Greeks. The city was able to withstand for a long time despite numerous attacks and sieges, which fed the myth of its invincibility. During the 10-year siege, numerous epic battles and personal duels occurred between the heroes of both sides. Homer's Iliad describes many of these dramatic events, including the wrath of Achilles, who temporarily withdrew from the fight, and the heroic deeds of the Trojan prince Hector. The siege was characterized by strategic maneuvers, diplomatic negotiations, and repeated attacks and retreats. This long duration of the war also reflected the complexity of the political situation, as various Greek leaders competed for power and glory while simultaneously confronting the united Trojan defense. The resilience of Troy and the determination of the Greeks made the war a dramatic and epic conflict that gained significance in the ancient world far beyond its immediate consequences. The Greek invasion and the subsequent siege of Troy were not only understood as a military event, but also developed over the centuries into a symbolic myth that deals with themes such as honor, betrayal, love, and fate. The idea of a decades-long struggle for glory and justice continues to shape the cultural perception of war and heroism in the Western tradition. Famous heroes. The Siege of Troy is primarily defined by the legendary heroes of both sides, whose deeds and destinies remain unforgettable in ancient literature. On the Greek side, Achilles, Odysseus, and Ajax particularly stand out. Achilles is considered the greatest warrior of the Greeks and represents invincible bravery and almost divine strength. Odysseus, on the other hand, is known for his cleverness, cunning, and diplomatic skill. He is not only an excellent fighter, but also a brilliant strategist who later became famous for his adventurous journey home in the Odyssey. Ajax, often called the Great Ajax, is considered one of the strongest and bravest fighters, characterized by his steadfastness and physical strength. He is an important defender of the Greek position in Troy and a symbol of unwavering courage. On the Trojan side, Hector and Aeneas are of great importance. Hector, the eldest son of King Priam, is considered the noblest and bravest defender of Troy. His role as protector of the city and his family makes him one of the central figures in the Trojan myth. Hector's fighting spirit, his human weaknesses, and his willingness to sacrifice give the Trojan side dignity and strength. Aeneas, another prince of Troy, is less known for his direct participation in battle, but gains enormous importance in later narratives, and especially in Roman mythology. He is considered a survivor of Troy's destruction and the founder of the ancestors of Rome, thereby bridging Greek and Roman mythology. These heroes embody different ideals and character traits that have shaped the image of war, honor, and humanity in ancient Greece and beyond. Their stories are closely intertwined and reflect the complex human and divine forces at work in the Trojan War. The epic narratives about these figures have profoundly influenced the literature, art, and culture of the Western world, making the Trojan War an enduring symbol of heroism and tragedy. Wrath of Achilles. The Wrath of Achilles is one of the central and most frequently told themes of the Iliad and decisively shapes the course of the Trojan War. This conflict begins when Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces, insults Achilles and deprives him of his honor in a dispute over war booty, the young warrior woman Briseis. Achilles, considered the undisputed strongest and bravest warrior of Greece, feels deeply hurt and humiliated. His pride and honor, which are of utmost importance for a hero of Greek antiquity, are severely attacked. In response, he withdraws from the fight and refuses his support to the Greeks. This decision has far-reaching consequences for the further course of the war, because without Achilles, who was considered an indispensable weapon, the Greeks get into great distress. The Trojans take advantage of the absence of their most dangerous opponent and increasingly gain the upper hand. Achilles' wrath is not only a personal matter, but becomes a symbol of the tension between personal honor and the common good of the community. It represents the inner struggle of a hero between rage, pride, and duty. During his absence from the battlefield, it becomes particularly clear how important Achilles is for the Greek victory. His close friends like Patroclus try in vain to support the troops, and their death, especially the loss of Patroclus, becomes the decisive trigger that finally pulls Achilles out of his bitterness. His wrath transforms into an even greater hatred against the Trojans, especially against Hector, the murderer of his friend. Achilles' return to battle is characterized by bloody revenge and unbridled fighting fury. The Wrath of Achilles is therefore more than just an episode in an ancient war epic. It shows the complexity of human emotions and conflicts in extreme situations. It makes the hero human and tangible, but also shows the destructive power of pride and revenge. In literature, this conflict has been interpreted in many ways and still symbolizes today the struggle between egoism and responsibility, between personal pain and duty to the community. Thus, the Wrath of Achilles remains one of the most impressive and moving stories of the ancient world. Death of Hector. The death of Hector is considered one of the most tragic and dramatic events in the Trojan War and plays a central role in the Iliad. Hector, the eldest son of King Priam and the leading defender of Troy, stands for courage, conscientiousness, and responsibility towards his family and city. As the hero of the Trojans, he is the antagonist of the Greek warrior Achilles, who is considered invincible by the Greeks. An epic battle erupts between the two heroes, which ultimately significantly influences the fate of Troy. The conflict between Hector and Achilles is not merely a duel, but symbolizes the struggle between two cultures, two warrior ideals, and also the tragedy of war itself. Hector fights out of loyalty to his people and his family, while Achilles is driven by personal anger and revenge. After Achilles mourns the death of his friend Patroclus, his hatred for Hector becomes relentless. In the decisive duel, Achilles kills Hector by striking him down in battle and then desecrating his corpse by dragging him around the city moat with his chariot. Hector's death significantly weakens Troy's defense, for he was the most important military leader and the moral pillar of the city. Without him, the Trojans lose not only their best fighter but also their beacon of hope. Hector's death marks a turning point in the war and heralds the impending fate of Troy, the city's downfall and destruction. Despite his death, Hector remains a tragic and honorable figure. He is portrayed in the Iliad as a noble and dutiful hero who was aware of his responsibility and fought bravely to the end. Even Achilles, who killed his opponent, shows respect for Hector's bravery when he finally returns the body of the slain prince to King Priam, who mourns his son. Hector's death thus stands for the tragic dimension of war, the inevitable losses, and the fragility of human life. It reminds us that behind the great heroic deeds there are always personal destinies and human suffering, which makes the Trojan War a multifaceted and timeless myth. Death of Achilles. The death of Achilles is one of the most famous episodes in Greek mythology and is closely linked to the end of the Trojan War. Although this dramatic moment is not described in Homer's Iliad, which ends before the fall of Troy, later ancient authors and poets report his fate. Achilles, who was considered almost invincible, was killed by an arrow that struck him in his only vulnerable spot, his heel. This legend became so influential over time that the term Achilles' heel is still used today as a metaphor for a hidden weakness. According to the legend, Achilles had become invulnerable by bathing in the river Styx. His mother Thetis had dipped him in as a child to make him immortal. However, because she held him by the heel during this process, precisely this spot remained untouched by the magical water and thus vulnerable. During the Trojan War, Achilles fought fearlessly and with superhuman strength. He was considered the strongest warrior of the Greeks and inflicted heavy losses on the Trojans. Especially after the death of his friend Patroclus, he unleashed his full destructive power in battle. But eventually, even for the greatest Greek hero, the end came. During a battle, or according to some versions, in an ambush, he was fatally struck by an arrow. The shooter was Paris, the Trojan prince who had also caused the abduction of Helen. Paris himself was not a particularly brave fighter, but he is said to have been guided or even directed by Apollo, the god of archery and prophecy. The arrow struck Achilles in the heel, his only weakness, and led to his death. The loss of Achilles was a severe blow to the Greek army. Not only did they lose an almost invincible warrior, but also a symbol of the glory and honor of battle. After his death, Achilles was buried with great honor, and the Greeks erected a tomb for him near the place of his death. His extraordinary life story, his bravery, but also his wrath and his tragic end made him one of the most important and complex figures in ancient mythology. The death of Achilles exemplifies the limitations of human strength. Even if it seems to be of divine origin, even the greatest hero cannot escape fate. In his case, the theme of vulnerability is particularly emphasized. Precisely that small spot that was forgotten or overlooked led to his end. This story conveys a deep symbolic meaning that extends far beyond the myth and is still relevant in our time. The so-called Trojan horse is one of the most famous and at the same time most cunning episodes in all of Greek mythology. It marks the turning point in the Trojan War and represents the culmination of the cunning and strategic intelligence of the Greek hero Odysseus. After 10 years of fruitless siege of the strongly fortified city of Troy, the Greeks found no way in direct confrontation to overcome the walls or force the city to surrender. It was finally Odysseus who conceived a brilliant ruse, a gigantic wooden horse, hollow and built to accommodate a group of armed warriors. The plan was as bold as it was ingenious. The Greeks feigned a retreat and left the gigantic wooden horse outside the gates of Troy as a supposed sign of peace and surrender. Allegedly, it was meant to be a votive offering to the goddess Athena so that the Greeks would have a safe journey home. At the same time, some of the best Greek fighters, including Odysseus himself, hid inside the horse. The rest of the Greek army seemingly retreated and hid with their ships behind a nearby island to give the impression that the siege had finally been abandoned. The Trojans, exhausted and weary of war after years of conflict, initially regarded the horse with suspicion. The priest Laocoon is said to have warned against bringing the gift into the city, uttering the famous phrase, "Beware of Greeks even when they bring gifts." But his warning went unheeded. According to some versions, even because he and his sons were killed by sea serpents shortly thereafter, a sign that was understood as a divine omen. Cassandra, the prophetically gifted daughter of the Trojan king Priam, also foresaw the disaster, but since she was cursed so that no one would believe her prophecies, her warning was also ignored. The Trojan horse remains to this day a symbol of a clever deception that defeats the enemy from within. The narrative underscores the ancient motif that not only strength but also shrewdness and cunning can be decisive for victory. Odysseus, who excelled not by force but by his intellect, became the epitome of the cunning strategist through this act. The myth has deeply ingrained itself in cultural memory and is used in many areas as a metaphor for hidden threats or clandestine infiltration, from the military to the computer world. Deception of the Trojans. The deception of the Trojans by the wooden horse was a masterful trick that ultimately led to their downfall. When the Greeks seemingly suddenly broke camp and disappeared, there was initially skepticism but also hope in Troy. Had they finally won the war, outside the gates, the Trojans found the huge, artfully crafted wooden horse, declared by the Greeks as a votive offering to the goddess Athena to ask for their safe return home. The Trojans wondered what should happen to the horse. Cassandra, the prophetically gifted daughter of King Priam, also knew of the impending doom. But she was under Apollo's curse. Although she spoke the truth, no one believed her, so her warning also went unheeded, and the horse was proudly pulled into the city, a sign of triumph and supposed victory. The Trojans celebrated exuberantly, believing the war was finally over. They had no idea that some of the bravest Greek warriors, including Odysseus, were hidden in the belly of the horse. In the night, while Troy slept and celebrated, the men opened the horse from within, climbed out, and opened the city gates. The Greek army, which had only been waiting nearby with its ships, was already there. The city was completely unprepared, defenseless, stunned by the celebration and the intoxication of victory. The deception was complete. In a single catastrophic moment, the belief in peace turned into a cruel reality. The Greeks stormed the city, plundering, killing, burning. What weapons could not achieve for 10 years was now accomplished by cunning. This scene is not only a central moment in the myth, but has been portrayed countless times in ancient and modern literature and art. It teaches that trust can be misplaced when it is given to the wrong party, and that sometimes not violence but deceit is the most destructive weapon. The Trojans' trust became their undoing, and their city went up in flames, a tragic end that resulted primarily from blind faith and ignoring warning voices. Destruction of Troy. The destruction of Troy marks the dramatic end of one of antiquity's most famous wars and forms the conclusive climax of the Trojan saga. After the Greeks had entered the city unnoticed through the cunning of the wooden horse, a merciless attack unfolded during the night that forever sealed Troy's fate. The Greek warriors, hidden inside the horse, awaited the signal for action. In the dead of night, they opened the hidden gate in the city wall and let in the waiting Greek army, which had been concealed with its ships nearby, to return at the decisive moment. The Trojans, stunned by the feast, wine, and supposed peace, were completely surprised and defenseless. In a flash, the Greeks took control of the city. They proceeded systematically. Houses were burned, temples desecrated, men slaughtered. The streets filled with smoke, fire, and screams. Women and children were enslaved or killed. Even King Priam's palace was stormed. The old king met his death there, brutally slain by Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, while seeking refuge at an altar, a symbol of the complete extinction of the once proud Trojan rule. Many other Trojan nobles and heroes also died that night. Only a few managed to escape. The city, which had grown over centuries, a center for trade, culture, and power, now lay in rubble and ashes. Its destruction was not only the end of a military conflict, but also the end of an entire epoch. This night has been repeatedly portrayed in literature as a moment of complete tragedy and human catastrophe. Especially in the Aeneid of the Roman poet Virgil, the downfall of Troy acquires an emotional depth in which suffering, betrayal, and loss come to the fore. Also in Homer's Odyssey, the aftermath of the war is palpable, as Odysseus is repeatedly reminded of the cruel events during his long journey home. The destruction of Troy is thus not only the result of a cunning victory, but also a symbol of the end of a great empire through human hubris, greed, and vengefulness. It remains a memorial to the consequences of war and a literary monument that continues to captivate people to this day. Flight of Aeneas. Aeneas was a Trojan nobleman, son of Anchises and the goddess Aphrodite or Venus in the Roman version. As Troy stood in flames and all seemed lost, he managed to escape the catastrophe along with some companions. This rescue was not merely personal, but later became the founding myth of an entire world empire, Rome. According to Virgil's epic Aeneid, one of the most significant works of Roman literature, Aeneas is divinely warned during Troy's last night. In a dream, the shadow of fallen Hector appears to him and urges him to flee. Aeneas, initially determined to die in the city, finally recognizes his responsibility towards his father, his young son Ascanius, also called Iulus, and his people. The scene in which Aeneas carries his old father Anchises on his shoulders while leading his son by the hand has become a symbol of dutiful piety and bravery, two central values of Roman ideology. The escape proceeds dramatically. Aeneas' wife Creusa perishes in the chaos of the destruction. Her spirit appears to him and prophesies that he will found a new empire far from Troy. Driven by this divine mission, Aeneas embarks on a years-long wandering journey similar to Odysseus across the Mediterranean. This journey becomes the basis for numerous stages. He visits Carthage, meets Queen Dido, traverses the underworld, and receives his divine destiny from the realm of spirits. Ultimately, Aeneas lands in Latium in present-day Italy, where he comes into contact with the indigenous peoples, particularly King Latinus and his daughter Lavinia. After warlike conflicts, which form another central theme of the Aeneid, Aeneas finally becomes the progenitor of the Latins. From his son Ascanius, the gens Julia is later said to have descended, and thus also Julius Caesar and Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The story of Aeneas connects the Greek world with the Roman. For the Romans, Aeneas was not only a hero but a moral role model, pious, responsible, brave. Through him, they legitimized their descent from the glorious world of Troy and gave their own history a divine dimension. Thus, the flight of Aeneas became more than a rescue from the fire. It became the beginning of a new, powerful empire that was once to rule the world. Homeric tradition. The Homeric tradition forms the literary cornerstone of our current understanding of the Trojan War. Two of the most important works of world literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are attributed to the poet Homer, who probably lived in the 8th century BC. Whether Homer was actually a historical person or a name for an entire tradition of poets is still debated today. However, it is certain that his works go back to a long oral narrative tradition that is much older than its written fixation. The Iliad does not describe the entire Trojan War, but only a short but decisive section, the wrath of Achilles. This epic begins with a dispute between Achilles, the greatest Greek hero, and Agamemnon, the supreme commander. Achilles withdraws from the battle, which almost leads to disaster for the Greeks. Only after the death of his friend Patroclus does he intervene again, full of revenge. He kills Hector, the most significant Trojan fighter, in a dramatic duel. The epic does not end with the destruction of Troy, but with the moving scene in which King Priam asks for the body of his son Hector, and Achilles returns it to him. The Iliad thus tells not only of war, but also of humanity, honor, wrath, and reconciliation. The Odyssey, on the other hand, deals with the return journey of the cunning Odysseus, which lasts 10 years. The epic begins in the middle of the story when Odysseus is stranded on the island of the nymph Calypso. In flashbacks, the listeners learn of his adventures, the fight with the Cyclops Polyphemus, the magic of Circe, the song of the sirens, and the journey between Scylla and Charybdis. The Odyssey is not only an exciting travelogue, but also a profound work about identity, home, loyalty, and human endurance in the face of suffering and temptation. Odysseus' return to Ithaca and reunion with his faithful wife Penelope ultimately represent the triumph over chaos and oblivion. Both works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were written in hexameter verse and were originally intended for public recitation. They shaped Greek culture like hardly anything else and were memorized, recited, and commented on for centuries. For the ancient Greeks, they were textbooks for morality, politics, the art of war, and poetry all at once. Today, the Homeric epics are considered not only a literary heritage but also a historical source, not in the sense of exact factual reports, but as a mirror of a world in which myths, memories of real conflicts, and poetic exaggeration intertwine. Without Homer, we would know little about the Trojan myth, and Troy itself would probably hardly have achieved worldwide fame. A historical debate. For centuries, the city as described in the Iliad was regarded by many as a pure invention, a literary place created from myths, legends, and poetic fantasy. Until the 19th century, there was largely a consensus among scholars that the Trojan War and the city of Troy had no real historical basis. It was only through archaeological discoveries, primarily by Heinrich Schliemann, that the discussion gained momentum. Schliemann was obsessed with the idea that the city described in Homer's Iliad must have actually existed. In 1870, he began excavations on the hill of Hisarlik in present-day Turkey. His discovery of several superimposed settlement layers fundamentally changed perceptions. It turned out that cities had indeed existed at this site for thousands of years, including those that could chronologically coincide with the legendary Trojan War. Despite the importance of his findings, Schliemann's approach was problematic in many respects. He worked with aggressive methods, destroyed important archaeological layers, and interpreted many things prematurely. For example, he mistook a gold hoard he discovered for Priam's treasure, even though it dates from a much earlier phase, Troy Roman II, than the presumed Troy of the Iliad, Troy VI and Via. Only later archaeologists, including Wilhelm Dürpfeld and Karl Blegen, brought more clarity through more systematic investigations. Today, many researchers suspect that Troy VI or Via around 1200 BC forms the most probable historical core for the Homeric saga. Troy VI was a powerful city with impressive fortifications, while Troy Via ended with violent destruction, which corresponds to the idea of a war. However, even if the existence of Troy as a city is now considered certain, the question of whether a war like the one described by Homer actually took place remains controversial. Some historians assume that the conflict may have involved economic and strategic disputes between the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and other peoples in the eastern Mediterranean. Troy was located on an important trade route between the Aegean and Black Sea regions, a worthwhile target for competing powers. The debate is therefore not over, but one thing is certain. The legend of Troy has a real, tangible origin. The archaeological finds do not provide proof of a concrete Trojan War as in the Iliad, but they show that the narrative did not emerge entirely out of nothing. The special fascination of Troy lies in the combination of myth, poetry, and history, a place where reality and legend are inextricably intertwined. Troy today. The current ruins of Troy are located on the hill of Hisarlik near the Turkish city of Çanakkale and are a significant archaeological and cultural heritage site, declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This award recognizes both the exceptional historical importance of the city and the outstanding significance of its preservation for humanity. Troy is not only a place of immense archaeological interest, but also a symbol of the connection between myth and history, attracting numerous visitors from all over the world each year. The ruins show an impressive stratigraphy, i.e., superimposed settlement layers, which allow for a detailed picture of the city's development over several millennia. Especially the layers Troy VI and Via provide insights into the architectural, military, and social structures of one of the most influential cities of the Bronze Age in the Aegean. Visitors can see the remains of city walls, gate systems, residential houses, and other buildings which, despite their age, suggest Troy's former splendor and strategic importance. In addition to the visible ruins, the site also houses a modern museum built nearby to display finds and artifacts from Troy. Numerous artifacts such as ceramics, tools, jewelry, and weapons are on display there, documenting the lives of the inhabitants of various epochs. The museum also offers informative exhibitions on the history of Troy, the Troy saga, and archaeological research, enriching the visit for those interested in science and tourism alike. Archaeological research in Troy is still ongoing. Archaeologists and scientists from various countries conduct continuous investigations to learn more about the complex history of the city and its role in the ancient trade network. New techniques such as 3D scans, ground-penetrating radar, and modern evaluation techniques enable increasingly detailed insights without damaging the fragile site. Furthermore, Troy's connection to myths and epics continues to be explored to better understand the historical core of the legends. The significance of Troy extends beyond archaeological research. The city has become a cultural symbol that is repeatedly taken up in literature, art, film, and popular culture. This broad reception shows how deeply Troy, as myth and historical reality, has entered collective consciousness. Overall, Troy today uniquely combines history, myth, science, and culture. The careful preservation of the ruins and continuous research contribute to ensuring that this fascinating city remains preserved for future generations and continues to serve as a bridge between past and present.